Hey, what's up guys? So in this video, I want to talk about radar detector testing and why in pretty much every time I talk about a test, I give a disclaimer that mentions, this is only one test. You need to take a look at multiple tests for multiple copies of detectors on multiple different courses against multiple different radar guns, and why no one test can give us all the information we need, and why we need lots of tests to really get a good sense of the big picture. So something I've noticed over the years is every test actually tests something a little bit different in a radar detector. Like, the general idea with the test is you've got a radar gun on one end of the course, and then you just keep driving towards the radar gun with different detectors, maybe different settings or whatever, and you see which one gives you the best range, right? But it's not always the case that the ones that give you the longest range is going to be the most sensitive detector. Like, that's generally the idea, but there's a lot of variables. I mean, one of the most obvious ones is traffic. You try to find a test course that doesn't have a lot of traffic, but cars and traffic can affect the results, whether it's actually blocking a signal and preventing longer range detection, or actually maybe bouncing and reflecting signals around something to actually give you longer range than you otherwise would, which is why we usually try to get minimal traffic and do a bunch of runs to try to, get a sense of like averaging out any outliers and stuff. You'll also see things like some tests are maybe testing more on-axis sensitivity. So like, the signal is coming directly into the front of the radar detector's horn. Other tests may actually be detecting off-axis sensitivity. So the signal is actually coming in to the detector from an angle, and depending on the design of the horn itself, the antenna, it may be more sensitive to on-axis signals, but less sensitive to off-axis signals. We also see things like maybe the horn or the circuitry can be optimized for certain frequency ranges. So maybe the horn is centered for 34.7, but it's weaker on 33.8 and 35.5, which is actually pretty common. They're kind of like optimized for the center of Ka band, and they start to fall off in sensitivity on the edges. Maybe the LNAs are designed in such a way where they're optimized for K band but not Ka, and vice versa. I've seen that with different manufacturers optimizing for different frequency ranges. The filtering settings that you can choose can have varying impacts to your sensitivity. Some of the filter settings actually affect performance more than others. Certain radar guns have different power output levels. So maybe one antenna actually outputs more power, so the signal transmits farther down range, and thus you can pick up longer distance alerts with those detectors. You can have different K-band guns. Some guns you'll get longer detection range than others due to power output levels, due to polarization of the antennas. Some terrains are going to be really, really flat, so you're going to be getting long distance alerts. Other times you've got hills and curves and trees, so you've got things that are actually blocking and absorbing the signal and reducing the detection range. You've got things where, like, the signal, it's not necessarily a linear progression as you get closer and closer to the radar gun. It's not like it's a weak signal that just starts to ramp up in strength like this over time. You may encounter something where all of a sudden the signal is basically non-existent, and then you crest the top of the hill, and then suddenly the signal gets really strong, and a lot of detectors alert in that same exact spot. And so even though there's differences in sensitivity between the different detectors, you'll find a lot of them start to cluster detector, and we usually call this things being terrain limited, where the terrain, it's actually clustering the alert ranges of the detectors. And so you may need to test on lots of different courses to get a sense of like different sensitivity levels, because the course may not necessarily show you the differences in sensitivities that exist in the detectors. And so in some courses I'll actually see like different zones where the most sensitive detectors may all alert right around at the same area, and then you get a little bit closer and there's another detection zone, and then the next group of detectors all alert in that range, and then you keep going closer, and maybe the least sensitive detectors all alert in this third detection zone. And so you start to see all these different variables of things that can affect the test results, that as much as you try to control the conditions as best you can and try, different detectors and mount them all in the same spot and do a bunch of runs to average out the results, like, there's still going to be variables, whether it's traffic, weather, rain can actually absorb radar. Humidity can affect the signals, temperature can affect things, how much foliage is there in the trees, different times of the year that you can test. The positioning of the radar gun, if it's angled in a slightly different angle, that can affect how much signal goes down range, or where the gun is actually positioned. I can go to the same course over and over and over, but the antenna, if it's in a slightly different position or oriented slightly differently, is going to affect how much signal gets down range. And so I can't take a look at the same test in the same course and just directly compare them, because the radar gun antenna position or orientation has changed slightly. And so there's all these little variables, and detectors themselves, I mean, there's going to be slight manufacturer tolerances between detectors. So one copy of a detector may be slightly more sensitive, then another copy of the detector. So ideally you want to test with multiple copies of the detector. Sometimes people wonder about juiced units. If a manufacturer sends a reviewer or a tester a detector, how do we know that that detector is not more sensitive than one that you would buy off the internet? So we're like, okay, let's go test the one that manufacturers send us, but then let's also test, other people will actually send us detectors, so we'll test ones that we borrow, or maybe you go buy a unit, you know, retail off the internet, or you know, you're just like getting a bunch of copies of detectors to test for manufacturers' tolerances. Like there's a ton of testing you can do, you know, in colder weather and hotter weather, different terrains, different copies of detectors, different radar guns. Like you just need a ton of data to all get a sense of the big picture and start to average out any outliers, or there's so many things that can happen that any one test cannot be reflective of all of the information that you need to alone give you all the information about the big picture. And so I'm constantly talking about like, hey, I'll go out and do testing and other people will do testing, but let's look at as many tests as we can with as many copies of detectors and different courses and different terrains and different radar guns, and put all of that information together to get a sense of the big picture. Because you may find in one test, one detector does really well, but then it doesn't do as well in another test, right? And it may be just the fact that there was a really brief duration signal, and just enough to a detector that can scan super quickly. It can just get a tiniest whiff of signal, and that's enough for it to trigger alert. But on a different course, somebody else is testing and they're like, well, you know, you don't get that little brief whiff of an alert. You get maybe suddenly every detector suddenly gets a really strong signal, and then a detector that requires a longer duration signal is also going to alert in that same spot. You know, and even slower detectors can give you longer distance alerts. You know, it's not just sensitivity, it's also reactivity that can have a big impact on whether or not you get the alert in the first place. So there's so many different variables that we can go into here for performance. It's not just raw sensitivity. I mean, there's so much to it. And so these are just some examples of why I'm constantly mentioning, and other testers are too, that this is only one test. You got to look at lots of tests from lots of different reviewers and to really get a sense of the big picture. And so I just wanted to do a quick video talking about some of the reasons and examples why we're all constantly mentioning that and giving the same sort of disclaimer. And this is just kind of a run through of some of the popular examples why. And so, yeah, that's just a run through of testing and some of the variances and variables that you'll see despite our best efforts to control the variables as much as humanly possible and test multiple detectors on multiple courses, on multiple guns with multiple different settings, etc. And so, yeah, that's it for now. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you guys are all doing great, and I'll see you in the next video.